Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here, supporting the Carlos Castañeda Foundation. And before I start talking a little bit about the Cuban economy, I have to make a confession that Jorge has anticipated. I'm not a Cuban, for which I apologize. But I'm from Argentina, but I had the good luck of meeting many interesting Cubans, even in my country, because a number of important people went to Argentina to establish their businesses because they were escaping from the Castro regime. So early in my life, I learned a lot about the perils, the trials and tribulations of Cubans in the exile. And then later, when I came here to the United States, I had the good fortune of meeting the late Dr. Jorge Antonio and Dr. Salazar Carrillo, that started being my teachers and then became my colleagues and my friends. And now we are practically, with Jorge, we're twins joined at the at the hips, right? And I'm very much immersed in the economy of Cuba because I think what happened to Cuba over the years is something unique. The process of destruction of human capital, of physical capital, of wealth of every kind is unprecedented in the history of humanity, I think. And I would like to stress two things that Jorge said before regarding the data that is available about Cuba. One very important source of data for every economy in the world is the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund was created in 1944. It was the consequence of the Bretton Woods Conference, in which three organizations were created, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and what then later became the World Trade Organization. Now, Cuba signed the charter of the IMF, but later withdrew its membership in 1964. So there's no reliable information about Cuba because countries that are members of the International Monetary Fund has to submit their economic information following very strict procedures, right? So much so that Argentina, the later government that manipulated statistics, was the first government in the history of the International Monetary Fund that was sanctioned because they submitted untruthful information about the evolution of the economy. Only after the new government was inaugurated at the end of 2015 and they reestablished the National Statistical Office, this sanction was lifted. So the sources of information of Cuba are basically other international organizations that are not so careful in monitoring the quality of the information they receive. Just to show you, I took the liberty of printing from the United Nations all the information they have about Cuba. They collect information, they calculate an alternative index of economic performance that they call the Human Development Index, because we economists rely mostly on something called gross domestic product, which is a broad measure of economic performance, but some people argue that that measure is limited in scope. So the United Nations decided at some point to include other things apart from the strictly economic things like health, things like education, attainment, things like life expectancy, etc. Well, the site of the United Nations, where you can find information about all the countries, has a profile, right, for each country. So I took the liberty of printing the profile for Cuba, and if you browse the pages of this report, you're going to have that for some type of information, for example, health, education, you are going to have information, but there are lots of categories of information where you will find N.A. not available. Right? Almost half of the information about Cuba is not available, not even in the United Nations website, which is a more lenient organization when it comes to evaluating the information about Cuba. So all this to stress or to support what Jorge said, in the sense that all the information that we receive from Cuba has to be taken with a grain of salt, because there is likelihood that that information doesn't exactly reflect what is going on. So that said, I would like to address a couple of issues that are in the discussion right now, especially after this reapproachment of the United States and Cuba happened in the last part of the Obama presidency, especially promoted by Pope Francis, right? So this created a great deal of expectations about the possibility of economic conditions and social conditions changing in Cuba. So the idea is to evaluate how realistic that change is going to be, or if that change is possible at all, right? First of all, there are two things to consider. First is the fact that now we have a different president with a different approach to this kind of things. So we don't know what President Trump is going to do about this approachment, right? Whether he will continue on this path, whether he will stop, or whether he will try to steer this type of approachment in a different direction, right? So that's one question that we cannot answer yet. But there's another question that has to do with the way in which Cuba economic system and Cuban political system works. Right now, Cubans have very limited opportunities for foreign capital to invest in the island. So that, for example, if you want to invest in Cuba, you are going to be partnered with the Cuban government, more specifically the military, which are the ones that basically control most economic areas. And also, you are going to be a minority partner, because the maximum equity that you can have, the maximum proportion, is 49% of the investment. Also, whatever foreign firms are operating in Cuba right now are not operated because at some point they decided that they wanted to invest in Cuba. These quote-unquote investments are the result of a situation presented to many European countries that after the collapse of the Soviet Union lended money to Cuba, hoping that Cuba would use that money to create export-oriented industry, and they would be able to generate enough money to repay those loans. Well, that never happened. So at some point, the only option that these countries have, or the firms from this country had, is to buy debt, Cuban debt, paying its own dollars, and use that debt to buy, quote unquote, participation in this type of industries. The other area where you can do some type of private activity in Cuba is the so-called cuentapropismo, or these micro enterprises in which basically a person and a few workers can do some type of private activity. The problem with that is that these micro enterprises are very limited in what they can do. For example, they can hire only a very limited number of persons. There are certain activities that they cannot do. They're heavily taxed, they're heavily regulated. So that, in fact, there is a huge incentive, as Jorge said before, to remain in the black market and not go formal and be officially recognized by the Cuban government. Another possibility would be to operate in a free zone that, especially created by the Cuban government, known as the Mariel Zone, which is not equal to things like, for example, China has, in which all these special investment zones are outside of the control of the customs, the local customs. They have a little bit more freedom of operation. They can, for example, a little bit more freedom in hiring people. They can, their participation can be 100%. They can have 100% ownership of these firms. But all these investments are regulated by a new legislation known as Law Number 118 that nominally opens the field for foreign investment. But when you begin reading the fine line, the fine print, you begin to find many ambiguities, meaning things that are not very clear, and that ultimately that is not a guarantee that if you're a foreign investor and you put your money in Cuba, if something bad happens, you will be able to get it back. Because many things ultimately are either solved by arbitration between the parts or resolved by the Cuban justice system, which we all know that it's not very impartial, or is heavily influenced by the the political condition of the island. So Cuba is in a significant economic dilemma, because even if this reapproachment between the United States and Cuba continued, in order for Cuba to prosper, in order for Cuba to be able to absorb foreign investment, then a number of rules, internal rules, would have to be changed, right? Foreign investors who had to be given more warranties that whatever money they invest in the country, they would be able to get out of the business if they think that the business is not producing the profits they expected. Also, well-defined property rights so that they could sell the business to other people if they wanted to. Those things do not exist yet in Cuba, and if they are not implemented, well, these expectations that this reapproachment had generated probably will not result in anything concrete. Right? So, what are the options for Cuba? Some people say that to follow the Chinese or the Vietnamese model. Right? Both in the Chinese and the Vietnamese economy, you have like two types of economies, right? I call them Frankenstein economies, because you have the old system that it continues to be controlled by the government and heavily regulated with a great degree of participation of the state, and another more independent, market-based, export-oriented sector, which is what has given dynamism to China and has allowed China to grow for close to 30 years at rates of close to 9% per year. Only now China is beginning to slow down because this high growth has come as a very high cost in terms of, for example, environmental damage, distribution of income, and a lot of problems that I would like to have time to talk about, but we don't. So basically, Cuba is in a very difficult situation because if they don't open the game, if they don't allow for more a set of rules that will genuinely create an incentive for people to go to Cuba and invest, this rebirth of the Cuban economy may not happen. And there's also a political problem because the Castro family and all the people related to them have a grip on all the economic activities, and obviously foreign firms entering the country and doing businesses more or less unregulated or with more freedom than the freedom that already exists may challenge this monopoly on power that they have both on the economy and the political system. If history of any indication, we have to look at the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe. These countries could only transition to democracies, however imperfect they may be, and market-based economies when the old political system collapsed. So in other words, as long as this political structure continues, whether it's Raúl Castro, the president, or his designated successor, if this political structure continues, I honestly think it's going to be very difficult for Cuba to transition to a better situation, a situation in which there is a bigger part of the economy regulated by market rules, and therefore the ability to produce more. To conclude, I would like to share with you a few figures. I don't want to overwhelm you, but to show you how dysfunctional this system is. Right? I'm going to refer to figures of 2015. I don't have more updated figures, but these figures are about the main sources of hard currency for Cuba. Right? And the total amount of money that Cuba receives per year from different sources is close to $10 billion, $9.7 billion per year. Of those, $5.5 billion per year are remittances from Cubans that are in the exile, right? Mainly in the United States, some of them in Europe. That represents 56%. Right? So more than half of what the hard currency that Cuba receives per year is not the result of export, it's not the result of any economic transaction, is simply aid from Cubans in the exile to Cubans that remain in the island. The second largest source of revenue for Cuba is tourism, that contributes 27% of hard currency. And exports, sugar in particular, which was the staple of the Cuban economy, right now represents only 2.5% of the annual source of revenue. Cuba, that was the the largest producer of sugar in the late 50s, now is a minuscule player in the world markets. So I want to close with these figures to give you an idea of how big the damage has been done to Cuba in this 50-odd years in which Cuba transitioned from a country that was about to reach a level of development compared to the most advanced economies in the world, to the situation where it's in right now. How a bad economic system can do so much damage to a country. So I'm going to stop here, and we're going to take questions from you, and also Ms. Castañeda would like to close with a few words before we go. Okay, thank you very much.